Motor vessel, vacate your engine room, vacate your engine room. We are prepared to subject you to disabling fire. That was not a metaphor. It was not a headline trick. It was a real warning sent across open water to the men inside an Iranian cargo ship just before American rounds tore into the vessel and shut it down. That is where the story starts. Not with Trump's posts, not with television graphics, not with a long speech about deterrence. It starts with a voice ordering men to leave the engine room because the next phase of the blockade was no longer theoretical. Then the firing started, the ship was disabled, the engines were hit, Marines boarded, the vessel was taken into American custody. And in that moment, the crisis changed shape. What had been a blockade built out of warning, pressure, and escalation signals became something much harder. It became physical enforcement with visible damage, visible control, and visible humiliation. That is the real story. The real story is not that one Iranian ship got hit. The real story is that the United States has now moved the Hormuz confrontation into its kinetic phase. And once a blockade becomes kinetic, the entire logic of the crisis changes. Every player begins making worse calculations. Every signal becomes heavier. Every next move becomes easier to misread as the opening step in something larger. That is the structure to keep in your head. One ship, one warning, disabling fire, a boarding team, and under it all, one much bigger fact: Washington has crossed the line from saying it will enforce the blockade to showing exactly what enforcement looks like. That matters, because crises do not become dangerous only when missiles fly at capitals or when fleets collide in daylight. They become dangerous when the category changes. Before this, the blockade still lived in the realm of coercion. A line was declared, ships were warned, tension rose, but governments could still pretend there was a clean difference between pressure and force. Now that difference is weaker, because once you cripple a ship and put armed men on its deck, the other side no longer asks whether you are serious. It asks what it must now do in response to seriousness that has already been proved. That is why this moment is so important. Iran now has 3 available roads, and none of them is good. The first road is to absorb the strike and do very little militarily. That is the safest option politically. It is poison. Tehran has spent weeks and still has unused capabilities. A regime that talks that way cannot easily watch one of its vessels get stopped, hit, boarded, and searched by the United States Navy without suffering a credibility loss. If Iran swallows this quietly, then every future American warning becomes more believable and every future Iranian warning becomes less so. The second road is direct retaliation. Strike an American ship, an American base, or coalition, linked infrastructure. That would answer humiliation with force. It would also drive the crisis up the escalation ladder immediately. Once Iran replies to blockade enforcement with direct military retaliation, the entire confrontation stops looking like maritime control and starts looking like open state. On state exchange in one of the most sensitive energy corridors on Earth. The third road is indirect retaliation. Use proxies, use the Houthis, use deniable harassment, drone pressure, mines, attacks on vulnerable shipping, or pressure against Gulf infrastructure. This is the most attractive road if Tehran wants to answer without answering cleanly. But it is also a trap. It widens the map, multiplies uncertainty, raises insurance and shipping panic, and forces more countries to react without guaranteeing that Iran regains deterrent credibility in the place where it just lost it. But Washington has built a problem for itself too, because once the United States has used disabling fire and a boarding operation, it has quietly created a new enforcement floor. If the linked ship tests the blockade and Washington hesitates, American credibility drops. If the next ship is also hit, then the pattern hardens. And once the pattern hardens, the blockade stops being a political instrument with military backing and starts becoming a live-use system of force. That is much harder to control. This is why people describing the event as a clean American win are looking at the wrong layer, tactically. Yes, the United States won. It intercepted the vessel, disabled it, and took custody. That part is obvious, but crises are not judged only by who wins the first exchange. They are judged by what that exchange makes everybody else become. And this one forces everybody into worse choices. Look at the Iranian side first. Iranian media had already been framing American military preparation as something bigger than negotiating pressure. In that narrative, diplomacy is not really diplomacy at all. It is cover, it is the public face placed over repositioning, airlift, reconnaissance, island, seizure rehearsal, and preparation for a larger blow. Once an Iranian ship is actually hit and boarded, that narrative inside Tehran gets stronger. The event becomes evidence. That matters because evidence changes interpretation. If Iranian commanders start reading this interdiction not as an isolated enforcement episode, but as proof that Washington is climbing a larger ladder, then every American move after this gets seen through a harsher frame. Flights, repositioning, drone activity, naval movement, all of it becomes easier to interpret as precursor rather than posture. And once both sides begin interpreting each other through maximum, threat logic, controlled signaling gets much harder. That is where Yemen enters the picture. The reports of air activity connected to Houthi territory matter, not because the Houthis can decisively change the military balance, but because they are ideal instruments for widening the crisis without clarifying ownership. If the Arabian Sea is where blockade enforcement turns kinetic, while the Red Sea begins heating up through proxy activity, then the shipping problem stops being local. It becomes systemic. Hormuz risk and Red Sea risk start feeding each other. Naval escort burdens grow, insurance rates jump. Commercial actors stop asking where the safest route is and start asking whether the whole regional shipping system is entering a new risk regime. That is when the headline becomes too small for the event. The headline says an Iranian ship was disabled. The deeper truth says another rung has been added to an escalation ladder that already runs from Hormuz to Yemen to Gulf bases to global trade flows. And then there is the doomsday plane. This part needs discipline because it is very easy to become stupid here. The point is not that one strategic command aircraft in the air means nuclear war is around the corner. That is panic bait, not analysis. The point is that once continuity of common assets, strange messaging, airlift, and maritime enforcement all start appearing inside the same public narrative, the psychological character of the crisis changes. People stop seeing one boarding. They start seeing a system bracing for the possibility of larger stress. That does not mean the larger event is certain. It means the possibility of it has entered the atmosphere. An atmosphere in a crisis is not fluff. It is part of the machinery markets react to it. Governments prepare around it. Commanders read signals through it, insurance prices absorb it, media amplifies it, public anxiety hardens it. That is why threshold events matter so much. A threshold event is not always the largest event in a crisis. It is the event that changes how all later events are interpreted. Before this, ships could still imagine testing the blockade as a gamble. Now they know what the answer looks like. Before this, Tehran could still tell itself the blockade was pressure without proof. Now the proof exists in metal and fire. Before this, Washington could threaten without fully owning what a visible use of force would do to the rest of the board. Now it owns that too. And once that happens, every subsequent move acquires extra weight. If Iran does almost nothing, Washington will believe the method worked. If Iran retaliates directly, the crisis escalates openly. If Iran retaliates indirectly, the crisis widens while becoming harder to attribute cleanly. If more ships test the line, the United States will have to decide whether this was a demonstration or the first step in a repeatable model of blockade enforcement, and if more airlift, more proxy pressure, more command assets, and more maritime incidents start appearing together, then the entire region begins operating under the assumption that what started as a blockade dispute has entered a broader military phase. That is the decision trap now, sitting under this story. America cannot easily go soft after proving hardness. Iran cannot easily go quiet after public humiliation. The Gulf cannot stay calm if shipping begins to look like a repeating battlefield. And the wider world cannot ignore a choke point crisis once visible force, boarding teams, proxies, and strategic command systems all start appearing inside the same timeline. This is also where the economic layer starts mattering more than most people want to admit. The Gulf does not need all-out war to shock the world. It only needs enough repeated uncertainty to make movement feel unsafe and delay feel smarter than transit. That is how choke points exert power in real life. Not only by being fully closed, but by becoming too expensive to trust. Once that happens, the damage spreads outward, very fast. Energy markets tighten. Insurance jumps, importers pay, governments start contingency planning, shipping firms reroute or pause, and every state dependent on stable maritime trade starts asking the same question. Is this still a blockade, or is it becoming a live conflict zone under another name? That distinction is everything. A blockade is a political tool. A live conflict zone is a system shock. This event pushes the crisis toward the second category. That is why the next 48 to 72 hours matter so much. The strike on the ship was not the end of a sequence. It was the forcing event that now makes every next decision heavier. Watch what Iran does. Watch whether the next response is direct, indirect, or delayed. Watch whether shipping firms behave as if this was a one-off or the start of a pattern. Watch whether Washington repeats the model or quietly tries to freeze the line after proving it can cross it. Because that is where the real answer sits. Not in the tactical success of the boarding itself, but in whether the use of force on the ship turns into a new normal. I want to end with the line this whole story points toward. The real danger is not that the United States disabled one Iranian vessel. The real danger is that Washington has now taught every actor in this crisis that the blockade is no longer just a warning structure. It is a structure that fires. And once a blockade becomes something that fires, the question is no longer whether tension is rising. The question is how many fronts open when someone decides that kind of enforcement cannot be allowed to stand.